are singing this song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, 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 rockin' robin, tweet, tweet. Welcome to Life is Good, and guess what we have for you today? Well, actually, a week ago before we had it edited, but it's a wonderful show, taped, videographed, and mostly edited by Jenna Sladky, who is an amazing young woman who I hope you meet many times. I'm going to try and get her to work with me at NEK-TV shows. Anyway, guess what we have? We have a candidates forum at my house here in Newport, and we invited all the candidates, either in person, by phone, or by word of mouth, because one of the phone numbers for Mr. Touchette wasn't working, and so Laurie said she invited him, and I guess he declined. But they're all busy. They're running their own campaigns, and who's got time to come and eat brownies and homemade cookies at my house? Well, two of them did, Rick Ufford-Chase and Laurie Pomeranz Grimm. And we had an array of citizens from Newport and Newport Center, and I think some from Derby, because the Northeast Kingdom is affected greatly by the economy of Newport all the time. So even though they can't vote from away, their input and their questions are relevant, and I had a really good time. The intellect of this community and surrounding towns amazes me. And our candidates are good. All the candidates are good, with the exception of maybe one who can't stand any of us, but we won't go there. Mr. Charbonneau has done a lovely job as far as I'm concerned. He's gentle. And Rick Ufford-Chase gets along with everyone. I haven't met Mr. Touchette, but he's a fireman, which speaks volumes for his character, I think. And who have I left out? Well, whoever I've left out, I'm sorry. But an absolutely stunning array of characters we have running, and an even more interesting array of people voting. So get out there and vote, and enjoy this show, taped and edited by Jenna Sladky. Thanks, everyone.
And I was called to work for a little church in Montpelier with children and youth in the community, and did that for a year until I married Brian. And we lived in Cabot for 5 years, and then moved to Barrie, where we were for 10 years. And then Brian and I worked in that area. Actually I did several years with Kelly Temporary Services, so I was all over Central Vermont. But I did 7 years with the state of Vermont there. And then Brian was asked to take a driver ed position here at North Country Union High School, so we moved up here. And I looked after his mother, who came to live with us. So I have definite experience with insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, and elder care, firsthand. And then I went to work at North Country Hospital for a little while, did some other things, and most recently I was with Yankee Farm Credit, which is an agricultural credit association here that does loans to the agricultural industry, and that segued into a position with AgFirst Farm Credit Bank out of Columbia, South Carolina, and I'm a business analyst for them, and I work, we provide the background loan system for all of our agricultural credit associations, 18 of them throughout the country. And so I've been doing that particular work for about 4.5 years. And I've been active in the community since we came here. Our kids were in elementary school at the time, and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and the swim team at the former IROC, and loved it there. And really sad to see that go. And then just started volunteering, and I think I've been to just about every community study that was done since the RUDAT study way back in whatever it was,
2010, 11 was when it was produced.
Was that one?
I just looked at it yesterday.
Oh, thank you. And Community Matters, which I just found some information on the other day, some really great pictures from 2013. And Newport, and all sorts of them. And I think one day I'm gonna take a day off work and go sit in the city manager's office and start reading books. and see what's there. It's important to get involved in where you live. And one of the things I learned, I got it from my mother, is you just get it and drive. And so every time I moved, which is not too often, but when I would move, I would just get in my car Sunday after church or middle of the week when I had something. I'm very active in church things. And so I would literally go out and get lost. And the funniest thing was I had lived in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for a few years, originally from North Carolina, was living in Myrtle Beach. And I had moved back to Raleigh where I'd gone to college. And in the several years, just 3 years since I'd moved, like roads had changed. And I was like, I don't know where I am. And I would get lost. And those big cities, they just all of a sudden like cut off a road and send it that way, you know. And this was, if you can understand, before GPS, before cell phones. And so I have a really great sense of direction that my kids enjoy. And my husband, the driver and teacher, enjoys my sense of direction. And so, no, I just think it's important, and I use that story because we have so many people who have come here over the years, and those of you who have been here for a while will know that we've had people who have come here and they're here for a year or two, and they go, there's nothing to do here. Or, why do I have to go someplace else to go shopping? Or something like that. And my answer to that is, have you been out of your house? Because there's always something to do here. And you might have to dig a little bit, you might have to look, but I really think there's always something to do in this community, always something to get involved in. And we have great community people. And so I think that so just for me, the reason I'm running right now, and I'll go ahead and answer that question, is it's time. I've been part of this community for 17 years and started paying attention almost as soon as we unpacked the house and moved in, and it's time. So,
Well, thank you.
Thanks. I did not grow up in Vermont, but my mother grew up in Lowell. And the family property that she grew up on is still in our family, and it's been where our family has vacationed and retreated and done holidays together my entire life. So once my parents left the area where I grew up in southern Pennsylvania, about the time I graduated from college, really Vermont became our family home. My grandfather was very smart. When my folks got married and moved out of the state, he gave them the hunting camp that he built the year before I was born. On the property there as a way to kind of give them a tie to northern Vermont, and we kept coming back to that cabin. We're not very original in our family, so we called that was our cabin, and then my uncle, my dad's brother, built a cabin a little bit up the road, and we called that cabin 2. So our cabin became cabin 1, and then we built my parents' retirement home on the property, and that became cabin 3. And then I built about 12 years ago, 15 years ago now, I built, I call it the cabin that Craigslist built, because it's 80% used materials that I bought on Craigslist. There are no 2 windows that are the same in it, but it's winterized, and I built it for our family to vacation in, and then my wife and I ended up living there the last 3 years. That would be, help me with it, cabin 4, right? Okay. And then get ready for it. My sister tore down the first cabin and built her home about 10 years ago, or a little more now. And you would think it would be cabin 5, but it's actually cabin 1 again. So that's our family property.
Is that the proper word, cabin 1 again?
We call it cabin 1 again. It's all one word. So when the pandemic happened, I had lived for 20 years in Arizona with my wife, doing mostly advocacy work on U.S.-Mexico border issues. I'm fluent in Spanish, and so is my wife. We spent a lot of time there working with immigrants from Central America and Mexico, and all over South America, actually. And while we were there, I founded an organization and then directed, it was a nonprofit for 20 years called Border Links, that still exists. I think what I would call experiential education on U.S.-Mexico border issues. So people come for immersion experiences on the border, and we would take them into communities in Mexico, and they'd stay in folks' homes and really try to help them understand all of the turbulence that has defined that border for the last 40 years. So you can imagine I'm watching the current conversation politically that's going on quite closely. And while I was there, I got involved in a number of other projects, the most salient of which for me right now is I helped a Guatemalan woman who fled the violence in Guatemala in the 1980s and eventually was given asylum in the US to found a family restaurant called Maya Quetzal Guatemalan Restaurant in Tucson. And so we co-owned that together for 6 years, and then we had planned and eventually were successful in having her continue with it. And she just closed that restaurant a couple of years ago as she was ready to step back. So it lasted 23 years, which for any restaurant is a very long run. That's true. So a little bit of small business experience that I find myself drawing on regularly now in my work in Newport. We went from there to the lower Hudson Valley and lived in a little town called Stony Point, New York, located on the west side of the Hudson, about 12 miles north of the Tappan Zee Bridge, which now we're supposed to call the Cuomo Bridge, but I can't quite bring myself.
Thank you.
It will always be the Tappan Zee Bridge. So we lived there 12 years, and we managed a 90 guest room conference center owned by the National Presbyterian Church. And we used it as a it was kind of the peace and justice-y end of the Presbyterian Church. So it became the place where kind of faith-based human rights and social justice advocates came to retreat during our tenure there. Actually, it had been that before we arrived there too. And the most significant experiment we carried out there that was really brought to a halt by the pandemic was how the property had a bunch of small houses and apartments on it. And so we built up an intentional community of about 25 volunteers who received room and board for giving us some of their labor, but they were recruited to be members of a multi-faith community. So they were Jewish, Christian, and Muslim folks who were recruited intentionally because they wanted to live with one another to try and model what it looked like to try and build positive and healthy relationships in a world that's driven largely by interreligious warfare, right?
Oh, I'm
just
cheering
try
you
and
right
kind of
now.
put that out there.
I'm cheering you for that.
So we did that, and I want to be clear, the goal there was not to create one amorphous religious community. It was for each of those three religious traditions to practice the best of their traditions in a space in which all of the traditions were respected. So it was fascinating for me to live in that context. I really had grown up in a very tight Christocentric world, and all of a sudden I was learning about, I was practicing Ramadan with a group of Muslims and the fasting practice every year. And so it just really changed my worldview in many ways. And then the pandemic happened, and conference centers were the wrong business to be in a pandemic. Who knew? And so after a noble effort to keep it open by the Presbyterian Church, after a couple of months, it was clear that we were going to have to mothball the property and lay off all the staff. So my wife and I, in the summer and fall of 2020, laid off 25 part-time and 25 full-time staff. It was heartbreaking. Disbanded the intentional community, which went into kind of everywhere. They all disappeared and went in different directions. And we were the last ones out the door in late November 2020 and moved up here to the property in Lowell. And I came with an intention that I would keep doing kind of my social justice and human rights oriented work from here, which I have done. But about 6 or 8 months after I arrived, my sister-in-law, Eleanor, who was on the board at the time of Newport City, and still is on the board of Newport City Downtown Development, she called me up one day and she said, our organization has to exist in order for Newport to keep its designation from the state as a designated downtown, which draws state money in and creates tax credits for businesses that choose to locate downtown. It's an important designation. And the problem is, or was at that time, that the organization during COVID and through a variety of issues before COVID had kind of become defunct. So there was a functioning board of directors, and that was all. There were no volunteers, there were no functioning committees, no nothing. And so they asked if I would come and help to restart that project. And I was thrilled to be asked because I love this city and have my whole life. Why am I running? To get to my answer to that, we created a task force called the Economic Development Task Force in November, made up of names that would be familiar to probably all of you, of the people I consider the long-term, solid, really thriving business folks in downtown Newport. And we asked them to commit to meeting twice a month to become knowledgeable about what it would take to create a long-term economic development strategy in partnership with the city of Newport that would really turn around our downtown and build out our grand list and make this place and build housing, right? All the things we know we need for a thriving downtown. And that group began meeting in November, and by the end of December, Dave LaForce, who is with his wife Julie, the owner-operator of Built by Newport, the amazing furniture fabrications shop downtown. Dave chairs that task force, and he and I were talking the end of December and said, well, you know, it's all fine and good that we're making all these plans, but if we can't help the city council to turn around and really understand what these opportunities mean and have everybody pull in the same direction and take some risks to do the things that it's going to take to get this town to look like St. Albans does, John, right? After a decade of this kind of work. If we don't have that effort going on, we can't just do it as a bunch of well-meaning folks from the community. We need the city council to really get it. So that's why I'm running for city council. My sister-in-law, Eleanor, who was on the board at the time of Newport City, and still is on the board of Newport City Downtown Development, she called me up one day and she said, our organization has to exist in order for Newport to keep its designation from the state as a designated downtown, which draws state money in and creates tax credits for businesses that choose to locate downtown. It's an important designation. And the problem is, or was at that time, that the organization during COVID and through a variety of issues before COVID had kind of become defunct. So there was a functioning board of directors, and that was all. There were no volunteers, there were no functioning committees, no nothing. And so they asked if I would come and help to restart that project. And I was thrilled to be asked because I love this city and have my whole life. And I began just getting to know people on the street and little by little meeting folks like Phil and Kathleen. And then one day, would have been almost 2 years ago now, Sarah Chadburn was on my board. She's a commercial lender at Community National Bank who grew up in Glover, West Glover, and went away to college and came back here and now lives on the border between Newport and Coventry. And I said to Sarah, where are the young adults? I know they've got to be there and I don't know how to find them. And she said, oh, well, we could start with the NEK Young Professionals that I'm a part of. And so she put out the call to anybody who wanted to come to a gathering, and we all got together at the warehouse. Were you guys at that?
Yeah.
No, we weren't at that.
Maybe not the very first one, but yeah, like the second one.
We began gathering that, so it was like April of 2022 that we started meeting. And that first meeting, I just took my laptop and said, y'all don't know me, but I'm just interested in whatever you have to say. What doesn't exist in Newport that should? And I just sat and took notes, and this group of 12 or 15 young adults just kind of started creating ideas together, and then discovered that they really liked each other. And so we started meeting monthly, and that morphed into, eventually we kind of came up with the idea of the Winter Saturdays dances, which I now describe as the soul of Newport City downtown development.
Amen.
Here, here.
It's really quite remarkable what goes on. And there are now, if they don't all come to every meeting, but there are well over 20 people that we call the crew who put those events together, and Felicia's now co-chairing that task force, that little group.
42 people on the email list.
How many?
42 on our
Oh my gosh,
Wow.
42 on the mailing list. So, and all of a sudden, you know, we started discovering there was some spirit, and people started showing up at these gatherings that we were doing on Saturday nights last winter. At first people were like, oh, Rick, you know, nobody's gonna come out, it's cold, everybody wants to stay home. And I was like, you know what?
Snowy, it's high season.
I remember when I was a teenager and, you know, a young adult, my grandparents would get on old, beat up, low-heat snow machines wearing wool, nothing of this fancy stuff they wear today, right? And go out at 1 o'clock in the morning, and that was fun for them. You can't tell me the cold is what's keeping people at home right now. Not to mention, Phil turns a whole world into cutting a pool in the lake in the middle of
And
winter.
they all come.
Good time to swim.
So, and we were right. You know, what we discovered was if we just put together good food and good music and make it inexpensive and make it available to families, there are people coming from all over the northern part of the NEK. Since then, that was kind of the initial impetus, and now we have really active volunteer efforts going in community design. We're about to try to implement a sculpture project that we've done in conjunction with students at the high school, art students at the high school. We've got this project going on downtown, I guess I'm pointing in the right direction, where we purchased the house on the corner of Union and East Main, and the high school kids from the North Country Career Center are renovating that house as a live work opportunity. So, you know, little by little, we're beginning to get into real hands-on projects.
Going on with that house.
Yeah, that's what's going on. You should check it out. It's pretty cool.
It's giving those kids so much practical experience.
Well, and they used to do it. This is just rebirthing a program that used to exist here. So,
Yeah.
and then this fall, we created a task force called the Economic Development Task Force in November, made up of names that would be familiar to probably all of you, of the people I consider the long-term, solid, really thriving business folks in downtown Newport. And we asked them to commit to meeting twice a month to become knowledgeable about what it would take to create a long-term economic development strategy in partnership with the city of Newport that would really turn around our downtown and build out our grand list and make this and build housing, right? All the things we know we need for a thriving downtown. And that group began meeting in November, and by the end of December, Dave LaForce, who is with his wife Julie, the owner-operator of Built by Newport, the amazing furniture fabrications shop downtown. Dave chairs that task force, and he and I were talking the end of December and said, well, you know, it's all fine and good that we're making all these plans, but if we can't help the city council to turn around and really understand what these opportunities mean and have everybody pull in the same direction and take some risks to do the things that it's going to take to get this town to look like St. Albans does, John, right? After a decade of this kind of work. If we don't have that effort going on, we can't just do it as a bunch of well-meaning folks from the community. We need the city council to really get it. So that's why I'm running for city council. My wife and I have now moved into town. We bought the really cool house just above the monster skating rink on Western Avenue on the backside of Gardner Park there. And we moved into town about a little over a month ago now. And
Is it the house that looks like a lighthouse?
No, just this side of the lighthouse. So there's a long field with the greenhouse kind of right in the middle of it.
Okay.
We bought that property. So, yeah, you can't miss it right now because it's the one with all my Burma Shave signs in front of it.
Okay.
Right
So-
next to where the next Taco Bell is gonna be, right?
Well, I gotta say, it's not an accident that we bought that property because in fact, it's zoned commercial residential.
Yep.
Oh, no.
And we know that over the next decade,
Yeah.
we're gonna have to start moving and shaping in order to get the right businesses in the right locations adjacent to our downtown. So, while Phil may be slightly facetious, in fact,
Never.
though my wife did say to me, I'll move in there now, but if you put a Wendy's next door, I'm out. 250 renovations are happening this year in the state legislature. Democrats, Republicans, everybody agrees it's got to happen.
Yes.
In part because of this very question. Act 250, everybody pretty much tells me they agree. I'm not an expert on 250, but everybody pretty much agrees that an unintended consequence has been that it makes it very, very difficult to build high-density communities in our downtown areas. And we have to have that density.
So
The city is
The
right
city
now
should.
redoing its zoning bylaws.
it should.
And they are absolutely having this conversation. A project that some of us in the room have worked together on the last couple of months. And that is this, you know, when I came in the door 2.5 years ago, the mantra was that we want to be a four-season outdoor recreation economy. And you know, as I've gotten to know the landscape here, I've discovered that there's all kinds of amazing creative effort going on already that's been happening for years without recognizing that it is in fact the heartbeat of a four-season outdoor rec economy, starting with Kingdom Games, right, but including Memphremagog Trails, for sure, and the Northern Star, and a number of other things that I could name, the new sailing center, right? And so part of the question is, how do we band together and approach this together as a collective and say, what does it take to make Newport the hub of that four-season outdoor recreation economy that's known as the place to come if you want to be recreating in northern Vermont come to this area. So a group of us got together and worked on this really quite remarkable proposal in November that we turned in early December to the state, banding together 11 different organizations. It included Kingdom Games and one other for-profit corporation, though I don't think Phil's ever made a legitimate profit at Kingdom Games, but it's not a non-profit either. So two for-profit organizations, 8 non-profit organizations, and the city rec department all got together, and we wrote a collective grant to the state, a proposal for a $456,000 grant from Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economy Collaborative. And we will know in about 3 weeks if we've gotten that grant, and then it will take several months to get all the detail worked out because it was a very complicated proposal. The goal in that proposal is to say, excuse me, what does each of these organizations need to jump them in their capacity to offer more, and what can we all collectively do together so that the world knows what happens when you come to Newport, right?
Well,
You ought to be able to go on a website
Yeah.
and plan out a 2-week stay here, doing something different every day of that 2 weeks with one of the amazing organizations that already exists in this community. We don't have to create something from nothing. You know, when I started hearing outdoor four-season rec, I was like, well, you know, Phil White's a 4-season outdoor recreation economy all by himself with Kingdom Games, right? A lot of cool volunteers who make that happen, who bring attention to this community from all over the country and around the world. So the question is not how do we create something from scratch, it's how do we recognize the strength that exists in the community already. We're doing something similar with this little venture that's much more nascent than that other one, which is a group trying to get performing artists and artists from both sides of the border to start talking to each other about how to turn this little area that is basically Stansted, Derby, and Newport into an arts micro-region. So that when people come here, they're not thinking, come to Newport. They're thinking, wow, you're not in Newport unless you've also been across the border into Stansted or up to Georgeville or to BB Plain to see the what's the name of the little arts collective there? Soledad Arts Collective, right?
Yeah.
And that if we can work together so that all of a sudden what feel like little tiny efforts all look together like, wow, there's something really going on here. So that's, in theory, the way that we ought to be approaching all of our work, is not just how do we build it to own it ourselves, but how do we collectively recognize the strength that we all have together as a community. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that, because regardless of who asks the question, it's a legitimate question and one that deserves a thoughtful answer. And the answer from my perspective is, if you read the conflict of interest part of policy, it's primarily about the possibility of either the actual or appearance of possibility of personal gain from decisions that are being made by the city council. And so from that perspective, there's at least one instance in which I could imagine that being possible if I were on city council and also the director of NCDD. And that is that right now,
What is and
sorry, you came in later, so you don't know. Newport City Downtown Development
thank you.
is the nonprofit partner to the city in trying to revitalize downtown. And I'm the director of it. So, short answer is, right now, in this year's budget that's proposed, the city has been asked for $30,000 to support NCDD's work. That used to represent half of our budget. 2 years ago, our budget was just over $60,000, and the city was providing half of it. And get this, the other half was coming through Walmart money that was given when they moved up on the hill to help support downtown, also directed by the city. So in one way or another, at that time, 100% of our working budget was really from the city or directed by the city. That's no longer the case. We aren't taking any Walmart money this year. And we've asked for the $30,000 because we think it's important for the city to be a partner in the long-term strategy. But our budget this year is $145,000. So it's $30,000 of a $145,000 budget, not $30,000 of a $60,000 budget. And I collect a $40,000 salary for my 30 hours a week of work. There will be a question whenever the budget comes before whatever council we might get elected to, and who knows what that might look like, there will be a legitimate question about how we manage that piece of it. And the answer starts with a clear, transparent, yeah, there's an issue here, how do y'all want to handle it? And often the way that's handled is we find a way to carve out that part of the conversation and I recuse myself from it is probably the most likely way. But the problem is you've got to have someone who's, all of us, Laurie and myself and anyone else on that council, have got to commit to transparency. And we've got to be as vigilant about it as anyone else. And we've got to be non-defensive when people raise the question. Regardless of who raises it, it's a legitimate question in any public interest organization.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent question, Beth.
And there's actually the question of another candidate and a conflict of interest. And because it is out there, because Andy Touchette is on the fire department. And I think that people have an opportunity to run, but that has been asked because while he's not a full-time employee of the department, he does work as a volunteer and I don't know how all that works. I'm just putting that out there because Rick is not his position is not the only one in question.
And you can't avoid it in any small town. We're all doing a little bit of everything.
Yep.
So the question isn't how do you get someone on the council who doesn't have a potential conflict of interest. It's how do you create an open, transparent, and trusting context in which we can say, oh, wait a minute, Rick, this one might be one that we ought to talk about this on. That's all. The time frame is, if all goes well and we can pull together the city council and really get everybody on board, we should be able to pull together a proposal to it's called VEPC, V-E-P-C, and they're the ones who approve a TIF district application at the state level. And so typically it'll take us a year roughly to get our ducks in order to make that application. You don't want to make it early because as soon as you get approved, the clock starts ticking and you have 10 years to carry out all your programs. So all of your development work, right? So you want to have as much as possible figured out before you actually turn in your application so that when the clock starts, you're ready to go with your first project. I think we're looking at a 5 to 10 year plan to do serious economic development work in downtown Newport.
And are you also considering that when you're doing housing that you have to consider retail at the same time?
Sure. Yeah, you got to walk and chew gum at the same time. You can't do one to the exclusion of the other. And you got to think about services as well, right? Like what are the public services like, a family-oriented fitness center or whatever it may be that you want in that same downtown area. So you build a plan, and then the other piece of this that's so important is it depends on who controls the property. So the reason it worked so well in St. Albans is because the city of St. Albans decided to become developers. They bought property they didn't want to own in order to do the public development on that property, in order to then turn around and sell it, break even at best, to a developer who would build what they wanted in their downtown. Now, Newport may not be in a position to do that kind of development, but there are other mechanisms for how we can purchase those distressed properties that have potential in our downtown area and hold them for the public good until we can turn them over to the appropriate developer. That's part of the work of being on council.
Yeah.
Donna was asking, what is Newport's current status? And the answer is we are a designated downtown, and we have been one since 2008. And what that does is it bumps us up in order of priority when we apply for state funding. It just gives us more points for the award and gives us a better chance of receiving state money. And it also offers tax credits that can be converted into real cash. There are some pretty easy mechanisms to convert those tax credits for organizations or businesses that want to improve buildings that exist downtown. So there are some clear benefits to having it, but there's a lot more that we can and should be doing. And what part of the work of our task force has been to really become, if not experts, certainly well-versed in one of the primary strategies that's been used to do long-term economic development work in Vermont. And that's called a tax increment financing district. And I won't try and go a lot into the detail, but basically what it does is it says developers will not come to develop a property if it doesn't pencil out for them to make enough money to pay back whatever the investment was that was needed. And so what a TIF district can do is it gives us a mechanism to invest public money in public infrastructure. So things like brownfields mitigation and EPA-oriented work, right? Or sewer and water hookups, or a parking garage, or streetscapes and street widening projects. All of those would count as public infrastructure. And the idea is that you can use a TIF to create the infrastructure that will then make it possible for a developer to build what we want in that location downtown, whatever it may be. And I'm not just talking about the infamous, what I refuse to call the hole, I call it the development opportunity in our downtown. Okay, so how does a TIF work? Briefly, the way it works is you go through the state, you get an application passed that allows us to borrow money in chunks up to 10 years to do that public infrastructure work. And then the question is, how do you pay the money back, right? And you have to go to, each time you want to borrow money, you've got to go to the community with a community referendum and get their permission to borrow more. And the way it's paid back without hitting the taxpayer is that you freeze the current level of tax that the city is making on the property, and the city continues to make that level, and the difference between that and the new value of the property once it's developed is what pays back the TIF loan in the first place, right? And then at the end of that, let's call it 10 years or 12 or 15 years of paying back that loan, then you have a new value of your property on the grand list. Now you've taken a $2 million block and turned it into a $40 or a $50 million block. And that new level of tax remains on the books for the community to keep supporting the community into the future. So that's one tool among a number of tools that is available to us if we do our homework and really paint by numbers. So I'm going to hold and just ask, you were a part of this for the last 10 years or 12 years in a way that I haven't been. So do you want to reflect on it first and then I'll jump in?
Well, it's funny because I ran into Patrick Martell yesterday. We haven't seen him in a number of years. And same thing. He was involved in so many things. And the funniest statement he made was, how many committees, how many studies did we have to come in to tell us that we have a beautiful lake? Every single one of them ended with, you have a beautiful lake, that is your biggest asset. And what are you going to do with downtown? And I've been in private, I don't want to use the word private, I've been in small group conversations. I actually was sitting across the street in the old cider house where the warehouse is on one of the days that they were taking down the block. And I just want to say, because I answered this, somebody a week or so ago made a statement in some article on Facebook about the buildings having come down. And I said, can you just imagine today, in today's dollars, what would have to be paid today if those buildings had to come down today and not when they did? And so, however that happened, however you want to feel about that happening, it's created a potential that, a potential, an opportunity for us to look forward. And I think the biggest thing we have to do with downtown is multi-use. And it's retail, and it's some level of housing. We might have to move things around, but we have to have forward-thinking people who are looking at what's going to happen 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road when we might not be here, but we can get that groundwork started. And I've been in the same boat. Like, you go to a meeting, you have all this stuff, you get this great report, and then nothing. And then 2 years later, you find out somebody from Montpelier's decided to come in and do another study. And then somebody else brings somebody else in. We got grant money to do the studies. Why didn't we get grant money to do something? And I think those are potential questions we need to ask. Was there the thought that they could keep us placated by this kind of action? I don't know, that's just a thought. Was there a thought that maybe we would just be okay with the status quo and not look for those answers? And unfortunately, my personal opinion, and this is very personal for me, is that I believe that unfortunately some of our city leaders were just wanted to do that. They were just interested enough to keep us thinking that we were going forward, while, you know, some really great things were happening, you know, with the recreation path over here and a nice park downtown, just enough to make it look like things were happening, while NCDD was flatlined. And so that's, you know, that it is important. We need to look at everything, at all
I've
aspects.
spent the last 2.5 years making it a passion to look at what has worked in other communities. I've had the opportunity to go to the last 2 Main Street America national conferences. There are 1,100 of Main Street America affiliates across the country, and our organization is designed on the model of Main Street America. And they have all these workshops and things, and every year I've been focused on the questions about how do you actually bring your commerce of your downtown back to life. And I 2 years ago, I went to this amazing workshop put on by people from, I think it was Emporia, Kansas. They had made a commitment, my numbers may be a little off, but they made a commitment about 15 years ago that the way they were going to redevelop their largely boarded up downtown was to focus first on housing. They said, we just made a commitment to build out 200 units of housing in downtown Emporia. And what they discovered, they built it, and people moved into it as fast as they could build it, even before the pandemic. And now they're saying, like 2 years ago, they were saying, gosh, post-pandemic, we're looking at how do we build another 150 units, right? And what they've learned is that when people live in a walkable downtown, they will spend 40% of their disposable income within walking distance of where they live. Scott and Carrie being great examples.
We had a walk, Newport is an AARP designated walkable city.
Absolutely, right, in large measure because of one of those conferences, right? So I guess I would just say housing has to be first on the list, not last on the list. I can, you know, as the director of NCDD, I can go and do everything I possibly can for a new business that wants to get started on our Main Street. And honestly, they're going to hang on by their fingertips until we change the housing question. So we've got to deal with that first. And senior housing has got to be a part of it. Because part of our challenge right now is that we have seniors who can't afford to move out of 3-bedroom homes or 4-bedroom homes in our community and make room for other families that need and want to locate in them, because there's nowhere for them to go and stay connected to the people they love and the community they love. So somewhere in our downtown plan, we have to have that built into it.
I would absolutely love it. Unfortunately, most businesses, when they come here and look, say, we don't have enough population for it. And if I'm not mistaken, and I only know this from hearsay, but was it, I don't know, Planet Fitness or somebody that came in, looked at the IROC building and said, no, I don't know who it was. And YMCA has said, no, they would not bring, this is all what people have told me, that YMCA would not do a building here. They would only do like school-based programs or things like that. I think I would love a pool, as most, I think all of us in this room that have had any connection with that. Kathy and I used to do miles twice a week at IROC at one point. And they're very expensive. That's a dream.
Well,
But I think that if we don't start dreaming, you know, I said this to both reporters that I've talked to. You know, we've done all these studies, and the very first one I was involved in, they had some very, what I call, fantastical ideas. But just think, if 15 years later, we had actually done one of those things.
I think I would add to that a little bit, which is that we clearly need an overall understanding of where we're headed with Newport's downtown.
Yes.
And we are on the verge of being able to put that together. That economic development task force that I was talking about, these are the questions that they're asking right now. And there's no reason in the world that a family-oriented YM or YHCA kind of operation that includes a pool and or some kind of a year-round training facility, right? Those things absolutely can and should be a part of that long-range vision. And then it's a question, if we lay out that vision, it's a question of painting by numbers and going step by step until we hit each one of the goals in that overall plan. The time frame is, if all goes well and we can pull together the city council and really get everybody on board, we should be able to pull together a proposal to the, it's called VEPC, VEPC, and they're the ones who approve a TIF district application at the state level. And so typically it'll take us a year roughly to get our ducks in order to make that application. You don't want to make it early, because as soon as you get approved, the clock starts ticking and you have 10 years to carry out all your programs. So all of your development work, right? So you want to have as much as possible figured out before you actually turn in your application, so that when the clock starts, you're ready to go with your first project. I think we're looking at a 5 to 10 year plan to do serious economic development work in downtown Newport.
And are you also considering that when you're doing housing that you have to consider retail at the same time?
Sure. Yeah, you got to walk and chew gum at the same time. You can't do one to the exclusion of the other. And you've got to think about services as well, right? Like, what are the public services like, you know, a family-oriented fitness center or whatever it may be that you want in that same downtown area. So you're building out, you build a plan, and then the other piece of this that's so important is it depends on who controls the property. So the reason it worked so well in St. Albans is because the city of St. Albans decided to become developers. They bought property they didn't want to own in order to do the public development on that property, in order to then turn around and sell it, break even at best, to a developer who would build what they wanted in their downtown. Now, Newport may not be in a position to do that kind of development, but there are other mechanisms for how we can purchase those distressed properties that have potential in our downtown area and hold them for the public good until we can turn them over to the appropriate developer. That's part of the work of being on council.